today. I am zooming in from Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Boston, just outside Boston. And it's great to be here with all of you. What I'm going to do is spend the next 25 minutes or so just sharing about this book that I wrote last year. And it's a book that's not really an academic book. So it's really a synthesis of what I've been learning doing my academic work, but also just as a person committed to these issues for my whole life. I did check off the box. I've been doing this kind of work my whole life in some way or form. And as Flor mentioned, it's kind of personal, and I bring in my own experience. Like my insights are also based on where I come from and what I've been experiencing. And so I think my goal with this book is also to inspire people and to share examples of really innovative, creative leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I think we are all leaders in our organizations, in our communities, in our families. So I start kind of with that. To give you a sense for, to give you a sense for who I am and how I've come to write this book and bring together these different ideas. I'd like to just very quickly give a little bit of biographical material. I was born in Dublin, Ireland, and moved to the United States when I was 8. I was committed to environmental issues at the Science Policy Interface for my undergraduate. I then did graduate work in California, came back to the Boston area, knew I was more interested in the policy, social dimensions of the science and engineering. And then I worked first at Clark University, then the University of Vermont. And then I've been at Northeastern University in Boston for the past 5 years. And I've been really kind of integrating science and engineering and technology with social science and social justice issues throughout this career. So I'd like to begin by pointing out that the climate and energy crisis is really an economic crisis as well, and it's connected to a systems of economic injustice. And this figure here is showing the United States, the widening income and wealth gap. But this same pattern is seen in many other countries and throughout the world globally. And as you can see here, this shows just over the past 4 decades, there has been this dramatic increase in the share of national income and national wealth by the top 1%. And that means a proportionate decrease with everyone else, right? And we don't always think about this connected with sustainability and climate and energy, but it really is. And in what very tangible way, the polluter elite, which is basically a lot of the top 1% who are actually profiting from the current systems, have been investing during these decades to resist the transformation away from fossil fuels toward a more renewable-based future. So they've been doing that by investing in misinformation campaign to deny climate science and confuse us about the realities of the climate crisis, and also the dangers and the health impacts of fossil fuel reliance. They've also been investing in undermining our public trust in government and trying to convince us that government regulations don't protect us and are unnecessary for the public good. And then they've been also investing to minimize worker protections and worker rights. So it used to be that corporate culture was companies were proud of how they treated their workers. Now there's been a shift, and really most corporations prioritize shareholder interests, and they minimize how much they have to support their workers. And so this all together, as you can see from this figure, it's completely unsustainable, right? This is even pre-pandemic. So this was a year ago. The past year, it's gotten even worse. So we can't keep doing this. And if we do continue this on these trajectories, we are just going to continue to be ineffective in addressing the issues that we need to address. So I propose that the climate crisis is really a crisis in leadership, and that all too often we've been thinking about climate change and in isolation of other issues. And we've had this narrow technocratic lens that's based on kind of domination and control, and we'll figure out technologies that'll fix this. And by doing that, and also kind of thinking about climate in a very scientific way, which is kind of exclusionary for people who don't think that way, right? So we've been missing opportunities for connecting with people and improving the human condition. So an alternative lens, which I propose, and it's really taking off a different way of thinking about the world, is this lens of energy democracy, which is acknowledging we need to move away from fossil fuels to renewables. And as we do that, we can actually redistribute power, literally and figuratively, right? We can invest in people and communities so that renewable resources are owned and benefit local and regionally appropriate mix. We can base those investments on social justice and human dignity, and then we can leverage the urgency of the climate crisis to make this happen quicker. But the reason to do the transformation is just as much about non-climate related issues than climate issues. So the real power of energy democracy and why renewables are so transformative is because renewable energy, every community and region of the world has access to renewable energy resources, whether it be wind and solar at different scales. Coastal communities also have offshore wind or wave and tidal energy. Inland communities also have geothermal energy, which we have not invested a lot in. And so this heterogeneous mix that every community could have their own regionally appropriate mix. And the other thing that's transformative is renewable energy is abundant, plentiful, reliable. We know every day the sun is going to shine in one way or another, right? And the wind is going to blow. And so it's actually, and it's perpetual and free. The resource itself is free, right? Once you've leveraged the technology to access it. So chapter 1 of my book is called Growing the Squad. And the squad, you may have heard about, are these 4 junior congresswomen in the United States who are all women of color, who came on the national stage in Congress just 2.5 years ago. And they've really changed the whole politics and policy options. And the reason they've done that is because they've connected climate and energy directly with jobs and economic justice. They've connected climate and energy to housing and the housing crisis. And they've also connected it to structural racism and the violence that we have been experiencing with guns and with police. And by doing that, they have been able to really broaden the conversation and change the policy proposals that are now being considered. So I look to these 4 women as almost a representation of what is anti-racist feminist leadership. And when I talk about anti-racist feminist leadership, what I mean is leadership that acknowledges that the concentration of wealth and power is problematic, and we need to be doing everything we can at every step along the way to distribute wealth and power for the public good rather than the alternative, which is the dominant mainstream way of doing things, particularly recently in the United States with this patriarchal leadership. So anti-racist feminist leadership is based on collaboration, inclusivity, and participation. As I mentioned, distributing wealth and power is key, investing in communities, what people need, and reducing inequities and disparities by centering social justice, racial justice, and economic justice at the core. And also linking problems together is how we reach transformation. Whereas patriarchal leadership is actually based on intentional exclusion of people and focused on concentrating power and wealth among those who already have it. And it actually relies on exacerbating inequities and gender and racial disparities. And the only way to hold on to that kind of leadership is to systemically deny the problems. So this kind of leadership denies that there's a climate crisis, denies that there's an economic crisis, denies that there's a housing crisis, denies their structural racism, and tells, you know, people that things are okay. We just need to keep going the way we're doing things. But that all that is a strategy to sustain the status quo. So the book then goes into really examples of just inspiring leaders. And that's most of what the rest of the book is about. There's a chapter about leaders who are resisting the polluter elite. So Jackie Patterson of the NAACP is one of the leaders that I talk about, and she and her team in the Environmental and Climate Justice Program have been revealing how the fossil fuel industry has been manipulating Black communities in particular to get kind of consent for more industrial and fossil fuel infrastructure, even though that infrastructure then ends up hurting those very same communities. Another leader is Jasmine Banks of Uncoke My Campus, which is an organization that points out the influence of fossil fuel industry in universities, and that has just revealing that influence is really important. Another leader is Maura Healey, who is the Massachusetts Attorney General here where I live. She's the people's lawyer, and she has sued ExxonMobil for using our consumer protection laws to say that they are you know, greenwashing and saying their product is green even when it isn't. The next chapter in the book talks about leaders who are connecting climate and energy with jobs and economic justice. And Varshini Prakash, who's the leader of the Sunrise Movement, which is the youth movement that has really catalyzed the action on the Green New Deal. And they've been in collaboration with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's one of the members of the squad, and that new approach to climate policy that actually is based on investing in jobs and communities is really transformative. And then other leaders in this chapter that I elevate are people who are focused on workforce training and making sure the workforce training for the jobs of the future are also equitable and inclusive. And Erica Mackey is at Grid Alternatives, and that's an organization that does solar installations in communities that have been excluded from solar. And that organization also trains people from those communities in solar installation. Esteban Kelly of the US Federation of Worker Cooperatives has been doing really innovative work considering how renewable energy companies could be worker-owned cooperatives, so new models of business. And Rowena Altmos of All In Energy has been focused on training and the jobs and making sure those are inclusive and accessible for energy efficiency jobs, not just renewable energy jobs, but also weatherization and energy efficiency jobs. So all of these people are really resisting this economic precarity that we've all almost become complacent to, and reclaiming the potential of public investment and really restructuring for inclusive prosperity. So the next chapter are leaders who are connecting climate and energy with health, well-being, and nutritious food for all. Robert Bullard is considered the father of environmental justice. He's among the leaders who's among the first to point out that so many Black communities in particular have been disproportionately impacted by industrial facilities and fossil fuel infrastructure and the health impacts of that. And Mildred McLean is an activist in Hurrenby House Citizens for Environmental Justice, and she's among the many Black women in the United States who are saying, we are sick and tired of being sick and tired. Gina McCarthy, who is currently the White House National Climate Advisor, she, throughout her career, she was also in Obama's, headed up Obama's EPA. Throughout her career, she's been advocating to connect climate with health more explicitly. And in response, several communities and cities have now declared the climate crisis a health emergency. Jillian Heshaw is a lawyer and advocate for Black farmers and doing some really innovative work connecting agriculture with climate and energy. Mustafa Santiago Ali is an advocate and leader really pointing out how the Black communities are more disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate. And Dorcetta Taylor is the researcher who has done the most work elevating how white the environmental community in the United States has been, and how that whiteness has biased the the orientation of the environmental movement away from health, because health hasn't been at the forefront of white Americans, in part because the Black Americans and people of color and communities of color have been much more disproportionately impacted. And I mentioned here Jacinda Ardern as another leader who on the international stage, her leadership, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, has demonstrated how, taking very strict evidence-based measures, New Zealand and some other countries run by women, including Taiwan and Denmark and Germany, were among the countries, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, where really held up as being most effective leadership, taking strict evidence-based measures, and then with compassion and empathy, explaining to people that these measures are needed not just for your own health or your family's health, but also the health of the community or the whole country. The next chapter is about energy and leaders who are connecting energy and climate with transportation. And obviously transportation is a big area, often connected with climate and energy, but moving beyond kind of the technical issues with electric vehicles and that kind of thing. There's some really inspiring examples. Representative Ayanna Pressley, who is one of the congresswomen who part of the squad, she represents me here in Massachusetts. She's really been a leader thinking about transit equity at the national level, and thinking that all investments in transportation need to be considering the equity issues. And Michelle Wu is a Boston City Councilor. She's currently running for mayor of Boston, and she's been proposing free transportation, making the buses and subways free. And obviously that requires rethinking the finance mechanisms, but that opens up all kinds of opportunities for enabling transportation. And we are accustomed to free roads and bridges, but somehow we are supposed to pay for public transit, which obviously is disproportionate impact on lower income folks. I mentioned Greta Thunberg in terms of her innovative transportation initiative or innovation when she came over to North America for the climate conferences, international climate conferences. I guess that was 2 years ago now. She took she sailed across the Atlantic both directions rather than fly. So housing is another area that there's really inspiring examples of leadership that are connecting climate and energy with housing. Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, she has been really advocating for big public investments in housing. There are also really a housing crisis in the United States with women and children in particular, housing insecure. There was a group of women who created an organization called Moms for Housing after they experienced a situation where they occupied a vacant home and then they were evicted with military style, like tanks and guns in the middle of the night. They and their children were evicted from this home that they were living in. And then they turned that incident into a move for really advocating for housing as a human right, and that we need big public investments in housing. The last example here is Indigenous women in Canada who have, they call themselves the tiny house warriors, and they are resisting the fossil fuel pipeline going across Canada by evoking their own cultural association with the land as their home, but also having these tiny houses that they live in that are on wheels that they can move to block the building of the fossil fuel pipeline. So I want to end here and kind of open it up to discussion, but the last chapter of the book really talks about what can we all do? How can we all leverage our collective power for this transformative way of thinking and doing. And as I mentioned, I really inspire us all to think of us all as leaders in different ways, and we need to act as leaders and then inspire other people to think of themselves as leaders as we advocate for systems change. It's clear that incremental changes are insufficient, especially if we think back to that growing gap, income and wealth gap, is that we need some big transformative changes here. So we can also all continue in our every interactions we have and continue to understand racism and sexism. If you aren't thinking about racism and sexism in your interactions and in your work, you are inadvertently perpetuating it, right? Because you are, again, kind of denying that it's a problem and then perpetuating whatever practices are the typical. So it's really a call for all of us to be comfortable exploring these issues in our own lives and in our work. Obviously, voting and engaging with elected officials is critical. Really prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion in all of the different ways that we engage. We can all get involved in advocating for local community renewable energy. We can all also think about how to leverage data and science and information to justify these transformative changes. We can all get involved in supporting cooperatives and other novel economic structures. And really, particularly in the United States, but I know around the world and in Europe also, there's increasing divisiveness among communities and people. And so I think we also need to not villainize people who don't think like us, right? And really listen and learn from each other. And I mentioned Mary Robinson, really an international climate justice leader. And she has said, this might seem radical, but really it's just prioritizing people. If we prioritize what do people need and invest in ways that are people first approach, then this, it doesn't seem that different or radical than the status quo. And I also end here just honoring Shirley Chisholm. She was the first Black woman to run for president in the United States in 1972. So almost 50 years ago. And in some ways, we've come a long way since then. And in other ways, we definitely still have a long way to go. So, so the examples in this book are primarily a lot drawn from the United States, just because that's where a lot of my own experience has been recently. But I also think that there's very similar examples of innovative, creative leaders in communities around the world, right? And so I really hope that this inspires people to learn from each other and get involved. And I'll end just by saying the book is available wherever books are sold, and all the author proceeds from the book go to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program to continue the inspiring work that they are doing. And Island Press, the publisher, has told me that this week only, the book is only $4.99 for the ebook. So if anyone wants to buy the ebook, that you're welcome to do that. So anyway, thank you so much. And I really appreciate having this opportunity to share these ideas, and hopefully leads to some good thinking with all of you. And I look forward to the conversations we can have now.